Pa, pam. Pa, 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 pam, pam. Bueno, a ver, gente, vamos a ponernos directamente con las audiencias porque ya han empezado. La verdad es que podría empezar los streams un poco antes para ir directamente a las audiencias. Pero por poneros un poco en perspectiva de qué es lo que va a pasar hoy. Bueno, sabemos que lo que estamos viendo estos días en Newtral, en las últimas 2 semanas, son las audiencias públicas del Comité Congresual que investiga el asalto al Capitolio. Es un comité formado en su gran mayoría por demócratas. De hecho, en su momento los republicanos se negaron. En este caso Kevin McCarthy, el líder de la minoría de los republicanos en la Cámara de Representantes, se negó a designar a congresistas republicanos que formaran parte del comité. Es cierto que él sí que había designado a 2, me parece que eran Banks, ¿cómo era? Banks o Biggs, uno de los dos. Bueno, luego era Jim Jordan. Jim Jordan, no me extraña que Nancy Pelosi dijera que no lo quería como parte del comité porque es un... Bueno, no vamos a desarrollar aquí, no quiero meterme en insultos, pero es un tío que tiene muy mala fe y entiendo que no quisiera que formara parte del comité, pero bueno, aún así es el que querían los republicanos. Si querían un comité con cierta independencia, pues tenían que haber dejado que los republicanos pusieran a quien quisiera, ¿no? Pero el caso es que Nancy Pelosi se negó a que Jim Jordan y otro más, creo que era Banks, no recuerdo bien, formaran parte del comité. Por tanto, al final, los únicos republicanos que son parte de este comité son Adam Kinzinger de Illinois, que se va a jubilar, bueno, se retira este año de la política, no se va a jubilar porque no está mayor. Y luego Liz Cheney, la hija del vicepresidente republicano Dick Cheney, que estuvo con Bush, y que es una republicana muy conservadora de Wyoming, pero que se ha posicionado bastante en contra de Donald Trump en estos últimos años, ¿no? Entonces, Liz Cheney y Adam Kinzinger, como digo, son los únicos miembros del comité, y a lo largo de estas últimas semanas han ido pues revelando parte de la campaña, de las iniciativas, estrategias por parte de Trump y algunos de sus principales aliados para revertir los resultados de las elecciones en 2020. No solo eso, sino que también pues, llevar a cabo iniciativas antidemocráticas que se consolidarían de alguna forma. Bueno, consolidar en realidad no, porque no llegaron a poder llevarlas a cabo, pero que tendrían su clímax, mejor dicho, con el asalto al Capitolio del 6 de enero, ¿no? Entonces, esto es un comité que investiga el asalto al Capitolio, pero también los prolegómenos, todo lo que pasó anteriormente. Y entre esas cosas, lo que pasó con anterioridad al asalto al Capitolio tiene que ver con las... un momento. Vamos en directo, ¿no? Tiene que ver con las audiencias públicas que vamos a ver hoy en directo. ¿Sobre qué van a hablar principalmente? Van a presentar pruebas y además a entrevistar, preguntar a testigos que testifican bajo juramento para tener más detalles acerca de las presiones que Trump y algunos de sus aliados, digo algunos porque no todos dentro de la Casa Blanca eran parte de estas iniciativas antidemocráticas de querer revertir los resultados electorales, pero algunos de sus principales aliados sí, por ejemplo Rudy Giuliani, el abogado John Eastman, que estaba fuera de la Casa Blanca, pero que era parte indispensable de toda esta estratagema, y lo que querían era presionar al Departamento de Justicia de Trump, ¿vale? Que en este caso el Departamento de Justicia, Trump elige al fiscal general, pero tiene cierta independencia con respecto a la administración, y lo que querían era presionar al Departamento de Justicia para que llevara a cabo iniciativas para presionar a distintos estados a que revirtieran sus resultados electorales, ¿no? Y aquí es la importancia de que cada estado, ¿no? En cada estado compiten uno y otro candidato presidencial. Si ganas el estado por mayoría popular, en ese caso te llevas todos los electores de ese estado. Los electores son según el número de ciudadanos que tengas, más o menos, ¿no? Es proporcional. Un estado como California tiene 55 electores, un estado como Wyoming tiene solo 3. Entonces, los estados que estuvieron más cerca de decidirse, por ejemplo, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pensilvania, Georgia, Arizona y creo que el otro es Nevada. Esos 6 que estuvieron muy cerca de cantarse del otro lado, ¿no? Apenas unos miles o unas decenas de miles de votos, pues ahí lo que se quiso es que hubiera electores alternativos, ¿no? Electores que votaron, o sea, que en este caso votarían por Trump, pues dijeron, vale, vamos a tener estos electores alternativos porque creemos que se ha cometido fraude electoral a gran escala y que los electores que van a votar por Biden no son legítimos, no son válidos, ¿no? En realidad no había pruebas de que se hubiera producido ese fraude electoral a gran escala, pero aún así querían tener esos electores alternativos. ¿Cuáles son las iniciativas que quisieron llevar a cabo en esas presiones al Departamento de Justicia? Bueno, pues lo que se pretendía era decir al Departamento de Justicia, oye, decid que tenéis pruebas del fraude electoral, presionar a los estados para que descarten los electores que hay ahora mismo oficiales y que elijan los alternativos, ¿no? Que en este caso serían los que votarían por Trump. Entonces, claro, esas presiones al Departamento de Justicia son terribles y eso es lo que vamos a ver hoy en la audiencia pública. Oye, tengo la cara como llena de... ¿Qué me pasa en la cara? ¿Por qué tengo tantos...? Tengo como muchas heridas, ¿no? Aquí está, vamos a ponerle sonido.
To overturn the results of the 2020 election. The letter also said this, quote, in light of these developments, the department recommends that the Georgia General Assembly should convene in special session, end quote, and consider approving a new slate of electors. And it indicates that a separate, quote, fake slate of electors supporting Donald Trump has already been transmitted to Washington, D.C. For those of you who have been watching these hearings, the language of this draft Justice Department letter will sound very familiar. The text is similar to what we have seen from John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani, both of whom were coordinating with President Trump to overturn the 2020 election. When one of our witnesses today, Mr. Donahue, first saw this draft letter, he wrote this, quote, this would be a grave step for the department to take, and it could have tremendous constitutional, political, and social ramifications for the country, end quote. This committee agrees. Had this letter been released on official Department of Justice letterhead, it would have falsely informed all Americans, including those who might be inclined to come to Washington on January 6th, that President Trump's election fraud allegations were likely very real.
O sea, querían publicar una carta desde el Departamento de Justicia que alegara que habían encontrado pruebas del fraude electoral, ¿no? Y que, por tanto, Biden no era un presidente legítimo. Sin tener las pruebas y publicarlo solo sin más porque tenían sospechas, eso podía ser una gravedad tremenda, ¿no? Porque daría como argumentos a los que alegaban ese fraude electoral inexistente y nunca demostrado, pero daría argumentos de decir, mira, lo dice el Departamento de Justicia, ¿será que ellos tienen buenas pruebas?
Offered Mr. Clark the job of acting attorney general, replacing Mr. Rosen, with the understanding that
Grande,
Clark
José,
would
un
send
abrazo.
this letter to Georgia and other states and take other actions the president requested. One other point. Millions of Americans have seen the testimony of Attorney General Barr before this committee. At one point in his deposition, the former Attorney General was asked why he authorized the Department of Justice to investigate fraud in the 2020 election at all. Why not just follow the regular course of action and let the investigations occur much later in time, after January 6th? Here's what he said.
Felt the responsible thing to do was to be in a position to have a view as to whether or not there was fraud. And frankly, I think the fact that I put myself in the position that I could say that we had looked at this and didn't think there was fraud was really important to moving things forward. And I sort of shudder to think what the situation would have been if the position of the department was, we're not even looking at this until after Biden's in office. I'm not sure we would have had a transition at all.
I want to thank each of our witnesses before us today for your role in addressing and rebutting the false allegations of fraud at the root of January 6th. And thank you for standing up for the Constitution and for the rule of law. Of course, not all public officials behaved in the honorable way our witnesses did. At the close of today's hearing, we will see video testimony by 3 members of Donald Trump's White House staff. They will identify certain of the members of Congress who contacted the White House after January 6th to seek presidential pardons for their conduct.
Esto, o sea, que luego hubo gente que pidió indultos, ¿sabes? Sabiendo que lo habían hecho mal, pidieron indultos previos, lo cual es terrible. Aquí es Adam Kinzinger, que es el republicano de Illinois.
I'd like to start with a personal story. So in May of 2009, I returned from service in Iraq and I announced my intention to run for Congress. A big reason I decided to run for Congress was my motivation to ensure freedom and democracy were defended overseas. I remember making a commitment out loud a few times and in my heart repeatedly, even to today, that if we are going to ask Americans to be willing to die in service to our country, we as leaders must at least be willing to sacrifice our political careers when integrity and our oath requires it. After all, losing a job is nothing compared to losing your life. Within the halls of power, in the face of a president, that commitment can easily be forgotten. Presidential pressure can be really hard to resist. Today we'll focus on a few officials who stood firm against President Trump's political pressure campaign.
Dice que hoy se van a centrar en varios funcionarios que resistieron la tentación, ¿no? O resistieron las presiones de Trump para hacer lo que él quería que hiciera por ellos. O sea, por él, lo que querían que ellos hiciera por él, perdón.
Careers for the good of our country. The Department of Justice is unique in the executive branch. The president oversees the Department of Justice, yet the president's personal or partisan interests must not shape or dictate the department's actions. The president cannot and must not use the department to serve his own personal interest, and he must not use its people to do his political bidding, especially when what he wants them to do is to subvert democracy. The president cannot pervert justice nor the law to maintain his power. Justice must, both in fact and law, be blind. That is critical to our whole system of self-governance. During this hearing, you'll hear time and time again about the president's request to investigate claims of widespread fraud. Our witnesses, Mr. Rosen, Mr. Donahue, and Mr. Engel, stood firm in the face of overbearing political pressure because they understood that their oath was to the Constitution and not to the personal or political interests of the president. The president and his allies became...
Si no me equivoco, el del centro es Jeffrey Rosen, que fue fiscal general interino cuando dimitió William Barr, que era el fiscal general que puso Donald Trump, ¿no? Que había servido a varias administraciones republicanas previas. Entonces William Barr dimite en diciembre y Jeffrey Rosen se pone al frente del Departamento de Justicia, y fue él el que recibió como muchas presiones para poder llevar a cabo esas iniciativas antidemocráticas, ¿no? De revertir los resultados en algunos estados.
To the conspiracies, people would have the justification they needed to spread the big lie. So President Trump ultimately wanted the Department of Justice to say the election was, quote, corrupt and, quote, leave the rest to me and the Republican congressmen. As you will hear today, the department's top leadership refused. Not surprisingly, President Trump didn't take no for an answer. He didn't accept it from Attorney General Barr, and he wouldn't accept it from Mr. Rosen either. So he looked for another Attorney General, his third in 2 weeks. He needed to find someone who was willing to ignore the facts. That is not the norm. Let's look at what attorneys general, Democrats and Republicans alike, have said about upholding their oath to the Constitution.
Attorney General ultimately owes his loyalty to the integrity of the American people and to the fidelity to the Constitution and the legitimate laws of the country. That's what he's ultimately required to do.
I will be an independent Attorney General. I will be the people's lawyer. If, however, there were an issue that I thought were that significant that would compromise my ability to serve as Attorney General in the way that I have described, that as the people's lawyer, I would not hesitate to resign.
As you and I discussed, if the president proposed to undertake a course of conduct that was in violation of the Constitution, that would present me with a difficult but not a complex problem. I would have two choices. I could either try to talk him out of it or leave. Those are the choices.
The Attorney General's position as a cabinet member is perhaps unique from all of the cabinet members. Yes, a member of the president's cabinet, but the Attorney General has a unique responsibility.
Bueno, están hablando aquí de la independencia que tiene que tener el fiscal general al frente del Departamento de Justicia. Esto es bastante gracioso porque en realidad no siempre hay una independencia tan clara, ¿no? Quiero decir, si no me equivoco, Bob Kennedy fue fiscal general en la administración de su hermano John Fitzgerald. O sea, os podéis hacer una idea de cómo es la historieta de los fiscales generales. O sea, los fiscales generales a veces siguen un poco las políticas o las iniciativas que podría abanderar la administración. No necesariamente, y vamos, esto ya sí que es muy... ha ocurrido en muy pocas ocasiones, ¿no? Que un fiscal general... No ha ocurrido, yo diría. Es que no quiero decirlo tajantemente, pero que un fiscal general haya perseguido a los opositores políticos de un presidente de Estados Unidos es gravísimo.
effing a-hole. Congratulations, you just admitted a first step or act you take as Attorney General would be committing a felony and violating Rule 6C. You're clearly the right candidate for this job.
So who's Jeff Clark? An environmental lawyer with no experience relevant to leading the entire Department of Justice. What was his only qualification? That he would do whatever the president wanted him to do.
Esta persona es muy importante, ¿vale? Para la jornada de hoy. Muy importante. Luego hablamos de él.
Democratic election. President Trump's campaign to bend the Justice Department to his political will culminated in a showdown on January 3rd. Today, we will take you inside that early evening Oval Office meeting where top Justice Department officials met with the president. At stake, the leadership and integrity of the Department of Justice.
The meeting took about another 2.5 hours from the time I entered. It was entirely focused on whether there should be a DOJ leadership change. I was sitting directly in front of the president. Jeff Rosen was to my right, Jeff Clark was to my left.
Ahora os explico todo.
Underscored. Well, the one thing we know is you're not going to do anything. You don't even agree that the concerns that are being presented are valid. And here's someone who has a different view. So why should we do that? You know, that's how the discussion proceeded.
Jeff Clark was proposing that Jeff Rosen be replaced by Jeff Clark. And I thought the proposal was asinine.
What were Clark's purported bases for why it was in the president's interest for him to step in? What would he do? How would things change, according to Mr. Clark in the meeting?
He repeatedly said to the president that if he was put in the seat, he would conduct real investigations that would, in his view, uncover widespread fraud. He would send out the letter that he had drafted, and that this was a last opportunity to sort of set things straight with this defective election, and that he could do it, and he had the intelligence and the will and the desire to pursue these matters in the way that the president thought most appropriate.
And he was making a pitch, and every time he would get clobbered over the head, he would say a call to order. The president's your decision. You get the chance to make this decision, and you've heard everybody, and you can make your determination. And then we jump back in, and really clobber him.
I made the point that Jeff Clark is not even competent to serve as the Attorney General.
Lol.
He's never been a criminal attorney. He's never conducted a criminal investigation in his life. He's never been in front of a grand jury, much less a trial jury. And he kind of retorted by saying, well, I've done a lot of very complicated appeals and civil litigation, environmental litigation,
vaya payaso el
like
Jeffrey
that.
Clark,
and I said,
tronco.
that's right, you're an environmental lawyer. How about you go back to your office and we'll call you when there's an oil spill. And
yes.
Pat Cipollone weighed in at one point, I remember saying, that letter that this guy wants to send, that letter is a murder-suicide pact. It's going to damage everyone who touches it. And we should have nothing to do with that letter. I don't ever want to see that letter again. And so we went along those lines.
I thought Jeff's proposal, Clark's proposal, was nuts. This guy said at a certain point, listen, the best I can tell is the only thing you know about environmental and elections challenges is they both start with E. And based on your answer tonight, I'm not even certain you know that.
The president said, suppose I do this. Suppose I replace him, Jeff Rosen, with him, Jeff Clark. What do you do?
Well, we know these men before us did the right thing. But think about what happens if these
O sea, están hablando de una reunión de 2 horas y media que tiene lugar en la Casa Blanca y están ahí los dos cabezas del Departamento de Justicia en ese momento, que son Jeffrey Rosen como fiscal general interino y luego el vicefiscal interino también, que es Richard Donoghue, ¿no? Luego también están Hersman, ¿no? Creo que es que se llama, que es el hombre que se veía con mejor calidad de cámara, que se veía declarar en directo. Y luego que era un consejero de muy alto rango dentro de la Casa Blanca, un consejero de Trump, y después está Pat Cipollone, ¿no? Que estaba liderando en ese momento a los consejeros legales de Donald Trump dentro de la Casa Blanca. Y luego el otro era Jeffrey Clark, ¿no? Que Jeffrey Clark dentro del Departamento de Justicia es un fiscal que estaba especializado en temas medioambientales. ¿Qué ocurre? Jeffrey Clark lo que propone es enviar una carta a los distintos estados para decir que tienen evidencia o pruebas de fraude electoral a gran escala y que tienen que elegir como una serie de electores alternativos, porque los electores que van para Biden, porque supuestamente Biden ha ganado las elecciones en estados que se han decidido por muy pocos votos, como Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Wisconsin, Pensilvania y Michigan, pues ahí esos electores de Biden que van a votar por Biden no son válidos, porque nosotros desde el Departamento de Justicia tenemos pruebas. Entonces, enviar esa carta con la autoridad que tiene el Departamento de Justicia es algo gravísimo. Entonces, Jeffrey Clark lo que propone en esa reunión es, oye, quita a Jeffrey Rosen como fiscal general interino, ponme a mí y yo voy a hacer todo lo que tú quieras que haga, ¿no? Yo voy a enviar esta carta, voy a llevar a cabo investigaciones para desmantelar todo este fraude electoral que se ha producido, pese a que no hay pruebas de ningún tipo, y vamos a sacar esto para que tú puedas seguir siendo presidente. O sea, esa es la oferta que tenía encima de la mesa Donald Trump en ese momento a través del Jeffrey Clark, este payaso del que se burlan, no dicen, o sea, este tío no puede ser fiscal general, no tiene las competencias, no ha estado en un juicio en su puñetera vida, no ha estado al frente de un gran jurado en su puñetera vida. Decía el Eric Hersman creo que se llama, decía, pero tronco, si es que lo más que sabe este tío entre environmental law, ¿no? Como leyes medioambientales y leyes de elecciones, election law, es la environmental y election. Eso es lo único que sabe que se puede comparar. No tiene puñetera experiencia en nada. Lo único que pasa es que está demostrando que tiene lealtad máxima por Donald Trump y está dispuesto a hacer todo lo que quiera por él. Entonces, esto, claro, es una gravedad tremenda porque estuvo muy cerca de que este tío estuviera al frente del Departamento de Justicia como fiscal general. Trump al final no lo hizo porque todos amenazaron con dimitir, o sea, no solo sus consejeros cercanos, sino especialmente el fiscal general interino y el vicefiscal. Así que nada, vamos a escucharles ahora a ver qué tienen que decir. Espero que haya quedado claro, pero si tenéis preguntas, decidlas.
Deputy Attorney General and finally Acting Deputy Attorney General. Mr. Donahue also served more than 20 years in the United States military, including the 82nd Airborne and the Judge Advocates General Corps. We are also joined by Mr. Stephen Ingle, the former Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel. He was nominated by the former president and confirmed by the Senate during the Trump administration. He served from November 2017 to January 2021 and has now returned to private practice. I will now swear in our witnesses. The witnesses will please stand and raise their right hands. Do you swear unaffirmed under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect the witnesses all answered in the affirmative. I now recognize myself for questions. First of all, gentlemen, thank you for being here today. All of you served at former President Trump's pleasure at the Department of Justice in top leadership positions with tremendous responsibilities. Former Attorney General Bill Barr told the Select Committee that before he left the department in December 2020, he told President Trump on at least 3 occasions there was no evidence of widespread election fraud that would have changed the results of the presidential election, and refuted numerous specific claims of election fraud the president was making. Mr. Rosen, after Mr. Barr announced his resignation, did Donald Trump continue to demand that the Department of Justice investigate his claims of election fraud?
Yes, he asserted that he thought the Justice Department had not done enough.
Thank you. From the time you...
Están diciendo que le está preguntando si después de que William Barr, el que era anterior fiscal general a Jeffrey Rosen, hubiera dimitido, si Trump siguió insistiendo al Departamento de Justicia que investigaran más acerca del posible fraude electoral que, como digo, nunca se demostró.
Between December 23rd and January 3rd, the president either called me or met with me virtually every day, with one or two exceptions like Christmas Day. And before that, because I had been announced that I would become the acting attorney general before the date I actually did, the president had asked that Rich Donahue and I go over and meet with him, I believe, on December 15th as well.
So after you had some of these meetings and conversations with the president, what things did the president raise with you?
So the common element of all of this was the president expressing his dissatisfaction that the Justice Department, in his view, had not done enough to investigate election fraud. But at different junctures, other topics came up at different intervals. So at one point, he had raised the question of having a special counsel for election fraud. At a number of points, he raised requests that I meet with his campaign counsel, Mr. Giuliani. At one point, he raised the whether the Justice Department would file a lawsuit in the Supreme Court. At a couple of junctures, there were questions about making public statements or about holding a press conference. One of the later junctures was this issue of sending a letter to state legislatures in Georgia or other states. And so there were different things raised at different parts of, or different intervals, with the common theme being his dissatisfaction about what the Justice Department had done to investigate election fraud. I will say that the Justice Department declined all of those requests that I was just referencing because we did not think that they were appropriate based on the facts and the law as we understood them.
Bueno, ha dicho básicamente que Trump le llamó en varias ocasiones a lo largo de su cargo, ¿no?, como fiscal general interino. Esto fue solo diciembre y enero de 2021. Diciembre de 2020 y enero de 2021. Entonces lo que dice es que lo que Trump le estaba pidiendo era que, bueno, Trump decía que estaba decepcionado con las iniciativas que estaba llevando a cabo o las que no estaba llevando a cabo el Departamento de Justicia en lo que respecta a investigar el posible fraude electoral, ¿no? Entonces las diferentes demandas que hizo Trump a lo largo de todas esas semanas, pues ellos no creyeron que debieran hacerlo y no lo hicieron.
Alleged that the Dominion voting machines in that county had a 68% error rate. The report was widely covered in the media. We were aware of it. We obtained a copy of it on the 14th of December, the day prior. We circulated to the U.S. attorneys in Michigan for their awareness. And we had a number of discussions internally, but the conversation with the president on that day, the 15th, was largely focused on that. And he was essentially saying, have you seen this report? He was adamant that the report must be accurate, that it proved that the election was defective, that he in fact won the election, and the department should be using that report to basically tell the American people that the results were not trustworthy. And he went on to other theories as well, but the bulk of that conversation on December 15th focused on Antrim County, Michigan, and the ASOG report.
Thank you. Mr. Engel, we know that Attorney General Barr announced on December 1st, 2020, that the Department of Justice had found no evidence of widespread fraud that could have changed the outcome of the election.
Eso es importante, ¿eh? El 1 de diciembre, William Barr, el que era entonces fiscal general, un poco antes de su dimisión, salió a decir públicamente que el Departamento de Justicia no había encontrado indicios de fraude electoral a gran escala.
No, I've never had any reason to doubt Attorney General Barr's conclusion.
Y dice que no, bueno, que fue vicefiscal general, dice que tampoco encontró nada como para dudar de las declaraciones que hizo en su momento William Barr.
Illinois, Mr. Kingslinger, for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the weeks leading to January 6th, the Department of Justice was fielding almost daily requests from the president to investigate claims of election fraud. Each claim was refuted time and time again, an effort Attorney General Barr described as whack-a-mole. When each of the president's efforts failed, he resorted to installing a new attorney general to say the election was illegal and corrupt, simply so he could stay in power. President Trump started leaning on the Justice Department the first chance he got. On November 29th, his first television interview after the election.
Where is the DOJ and the FBI in all of this, Mr. President? You have laid out some serious charges here. Shouldn't this be something that the FBI is investigating? Are they?
Missing in action.
Is the DOJ investigating?
Missing in action. Can't tell you where they are.
Republican congressmen echoed the president just 2 days later. They wrote a letter to Attorney General Barr laying into the Justice Department for a, quote, shocking lack of action in investigating the claims of election fraud. That same day, Attorney General Barr stated publicly that President Trump's claims had no merit. Ignoring the top law enforcement officer in the country, Republican congressmen amplified the stolen election message to the American public. Let's listen.
And so there's widespread evidence of fraud.
Es que, tío, qué responsables en realidad. Es que ahora da vergüenza verlo, porque es que esto era mentira. O sea, estaban mintiendo.
A big notation in history when it's written of the rise and fall of the United States, if they don't clean up this mess, clean up the fraud, do your jobs and save this little experiment in self-government.
Again, I join my colleagues in calling on Attorney General Barr to immediately let us know what he's doing.
We're already working on challenging.
Bueno, este está pirado, chaval. Paul Gosar es de lo peor, de lo peor, de lo peor.
And now what about the courts? How pathetic are the courts?
O sea, es atentar directamente contra todas las instituciones.
I'm joining with the fighters in the Congress, and we are going to object to electors from states that didn't run clean elections. Democracy is left undefended if we accept the result of a stolen election without fighting with every bit of vigor we can muster.
The ultimate date of significance is January 6th. This is how the process works. The ultimate arbiter here, the ultimate check and balance is the United States Congress. And when something is done in an unconstitutional fashion, which happened in several of these states, we have a duty to step forward and have this debate and have this vote on the 6th of January.
Today is the day American patriots start taking down names and kicking ass.
Mr. Donahue.
O sea, es que es una retórica completamente confrontacional y antidemocrática. No hay pruebas del fraude electoral. No ha habido pruebas jamás de fraude electoral a gran escala en Estados Unidos y menos en las elecciones de 2020, pese a todo lo que se investigó. Y estamos hablando de apuntar nombres, de decir que las instituciones judiciales no tenían ningún tipo de legitimidad, de que había que llevar a cabo, o sea, que tenía que responder la ciudadanía con fuerza y vigor. Era, o sea, silbatos de perros. Era simplemente decir, enchufaos, ¿no? Anímense que hay que luchar contra esto. Y es muy grave, es gravísimo.
Need to step up and do our job. And he had this arsenal of allegations that he wanted to rely on. And so I felt in that conversation that was incumbent on me to make it very clear to the president what our investigations had revealed. And that we had concluded, based on actual investigations, actual witness interviews, actual reviews of documents, that these allegations simply had no merit. And I wanted to try to cut through the noise because it was clear to us that there were a lot of people whispering in his ear, feeding him these conspiracy theories and allegations. And I felt that being very blunt in that conversation might help make it clear to the president that these allegations were simply not true. And so as he went through them in what for me was a 90-minute conversation or so, and what for the former acting AG was a 2-hour conversation.
Se está despollando porque de las turras que les pegaba Donald Trump con el fraude electoral.
No, that's false. That is not true. And to correct him really in a serial fashion as he moved from one theory to another.
Can you give me an example of one or two of those theories?
So one that was very clear at that point was the Antrim County, the ASOG report that I mentioned earlier. The Allied Security Operations Group released this report that said 68% error rate. There was, in fact, in Antrim County, a hand recount. And had nothing to do with the department. The department did not request that. That was pursuant to litigation brought by other parties, but there was a hand recount. So they were able to compare the hand recount to what the machines had reported. And for the ballots that were actually counted by the machine, more than 15,000, there was one error, one ballot. And I did a quick calculation and came up with 0.0063% error rate, which is well within tolerance. And so I made it very clear to the president, because he was so fixated on the ASOG report in the December 15th conversation, that in fact, our investigation revealed that the error rate was 0.0063%. So that, Mr. President's example of what people are telling you that is not true and that you cannot and should not be relying on. So that was one very explicit one, and I think you see that reflected in my notes. We went through a series of others. The truck driver who claimed to have moved an entire tractor-trailer of ballots from New York to Pennsylvania, that was also incorrect. We did an investigation where the FBI interviewed witnesses at the front end and the back end of that trailer's transit from New York to Pennsylvania. We looked at loading manifests. We interviewed witnesses, including, of course, the driver, and we knew it wasn't true. Whether the driver believed it or not was never clear to me, but it was just not true. So that was another one that I tried to educate the president on. There were a series of others, mostly in swing states. Of course, he wanted to talk a great deal about Georgia, the State Farm Arena video, which he believed, for various reasons, was, as he said it, fraud staring you right in the face.
Were any of the allegations he brought up found credible? Did you find any of them credible?
No.
So during this...
Bueno, un resumen de lo que ha dicho. Estaba preguntándole a Kinzinger sobre algunas de las... O sea, si podía poner ejemplos de algunas de las teorías que creía Trump y que le había presentado a ellos, ¿no? Al vicefiscal interino y al fiscal general del Departamento de Justicia, para ver si alguna de ellas era remotamente cierta, ¿no? Entonces, lo que ha dicho que me ha parecido gracioso Donoghue es que Trump les pegaba unas turras de hora y media o 2 horas contando todas estas teorías que a él le habían facilitado algunos de sus aliados más cercanos, Giuliani, John Eastman, cualquiera de estos, ¿no? Entonces, ellos lo que hacían era intentar llevar a cabo investigaciones en paralelo, tener las pruebas para decir, a ver, Trump, que esto no es verdad, o sea, esto no es cierto. Una de ellas es lo del informe en Michigan que decía que en un condado específico había un ratio de error del recuento de votos del 60% y luego demostraron que no, que el ratio de error era un solo voto y que por tanto significaba era como el 0,003%. O sea, una minimísima parte, ¿no? Un voto mal contado. Luego, en otro caso era lo del State Farm, ¿no? Que en el estadio State Farm, donde se estaban contando votos en Atlanta, en Georgia, se hizo muy famoso un vídeo en el que se veía cómo se movían cajas, ¿no? llenas de votos. Entonces ahí hubo mucha especulación y muchas teorías de la conspiración acerca de qué es lo que estaba realmente ocurriendo, si se estaban moviendo votos, si se estaba haciendo pucherazo. Bueno, pues luego se demostró que tampoco. Salieron 2 de las mujeres el otro día que habían estado que habían salido en ese vídeo, que les habían perseguido, o sea, que les habían acosado, les habían enviado amenazas de muerte. Les habían escrito por redes sociales, o sea, todo un drama tremendo, que es que había una de ellas que les daba miedo ir al supermercado y no me puñetero extraña. Y después en la otra teoría era la de un camión que había llevado votos supuestamente de Nueva York a Pensilvania, que también se demostró que era cierto después de que el FBI investigara, ¿no? Entrevistara a testigos que vieran los documentos acerca de lo que llevaba el transporte, bueno, en fin, que vieron que no era verdad. Y lo que dice Donoghue es que para él, o sea, todas las teorías que se le presentaron o que le presentó Trump, ninguna tenía ningún tipo de credibilidad.
Related civil rights responsibilities, so we do have an important role, but the bottom line was if a state ran their election in such a way that it was defective, that is to the state or Congress to correct. It is not for the Justice Department to step in. And I certainly understood the president as a layman not understanding why the Justice Department didn't have at least a civil role to step in and bring suit on behalf of the American people. We tried to explain that to him. The American people do not constitute the client for the United States Justice Department. The one and only client of the United States Justice Department is the United States government. And the United States government does not have standing, as we were repeatedly told by our internal teams, OLC led by Steve Engel, as well as the Office of the Solicitor General, researched it and gave us thorough, clear opinions that we simply did not have standing. And we tried to explain that to the president on numerous occasions.
Me he perdido lo inicial, pero creo que lo que está diciendo es que sus abogados, ¿no? La gente del Departamento de Justicia, que es gente muy top, llegaron a la conclusión de que el Departamento de Justicia no tenía autoridad para llevar a cabo demandas contra los estados por cómo habían lidiado con sus elecciones, si eran las medidas que habían aprobado en unos otros lados eran anticonstitucionales. Me parece que se refiere a eso.
Me and the Republican congressman.
So let's now put up the notes where you quote the president as you're speaking to that. He said the president said, "Just say the election was corrupt, and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman." So, Mr. Donahue, that's a direct quote from President Trump, correct?
That's an exact quote from the president, yes.
O sea, esto le dijo Trump a ellos, a los cabezas, a los líderes del Departamento de Justicia. Simplemente decir que las elecciones han sido corruptas y yo y los republicanos en el Congreso nos encargaremos de hacer el resto. Tenemos una obligación de decirle a la gente que esto fueron unas elecciones ilegales y corruptas. O sea,
Exact quote from the president, yes.
Let me just be clear. Did the department find any evidence to conclude that there was anything illegal or corrupt about the 2020 election?
There were isolated instances of fraud. None of them came close
esto no sé si es nuevo, ya lo ha publicado algún medio de comunicación antes, me suena que sí.
Of the election in any individual state.
And how would you describe the president's demeanor during that call?
He was more agitated than he was on December 15th. The president, throughout all of these meetings and telephone conversations, was adamant that he had won and that we were not doing our job. But it did escalate over time until ultimately the meeting on January 3rd, which was sort of the most extreme of the meetings and conversations.
So I want to make sure we don't gloss this over. Just say it was corrupt and leave the rest to us.
Es que es muy bestia eso.
The president wanted the top Justice Department officials to declare that the election was corrupt, even though, as he knew, there was absolutely no evidence to support that statement. The president didn't care about actually investigating the facts. He just wanted the Department of Justice to put its stamp of approval on the lies. Who was going to help him? Well, Jeff Clark. Mr. Rosen, on Christmas Eve, your first official day as the acting attorney general, President Trump called you. What did he want to talk about?
The same things he was talking about publicly. He wanted to talk about that he thought the election had been stolen or was corrupt, and that there was widespread fraud. And I had told him that our reviews had not shown that to be the case. So we had an extended discussion, probably 15, maybe 20 minutes, something like that, with him urging that the Department of Justice should be doing more with regard to election fraud.
Did he mention Jeff Clark's name?
Yes. It was just in passing. He made what I regarded as a peculiar reference. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was something about, did I know Jeff Clark, or did I know who he was, or something like that. And I told him I did, and then the conversation just moved on. But when I hung up, I was quizzical as to how does the president even know Mr. Clark? I was not aware that they had ever met or that the president had been involved with any of the issues in the civil division.
So it was a bit of a surprise when he brought his name up?
Yes.
So Mr. Clark was the acting head of the Civil Division and head of Environmental and Natural Resources Division at the Department of Justice. Do either of those divisions have any role whatsoever in investigating election fraud, sir?
No. And to my awareness, Jeff Clark had no prior involvement of any kind with regard to the work that the department was doing that Attorney General Barr has talked about to this committee.
So let's take a minute and explain why the president mentioned Jeff Clark's name to Mr. Rosen here on Christmas Eve.
Aquí ya empezamos a hablar de Jeff Clark, que era ese del Departamento de Justicia que estaba se encargaba de temas medioambientales, ¿no? Y ya empieza a sonar como posible sustituto de Jeffrey Rosen al frente del Departamento de Justicia para llevar a cabo todas las iniciativas que Rosen y Donahue se estaban negando a llevar a cabo.
I called President Trump on Saturday and said we've got to have a meeting. There's many of us that feel like this election has been stolen.
So on the screen you'll see that President Trump's chief of...
No one cares about your feelings. ¿no? Facts don't care about your feelings, que diría Ben Shapiro.
Several members of Congress just finished a meeting in the Oval Office with President Donald Trump, preparing to fight back against mounting evidence of voter fraud. Stay tuned.
Este era el jefe de gabinete de Trump,
On the same day, he met with these Republican
ya diciendo que había mucha evidencia de fraude electoral. Mentira.
And he used the opportunity to pressure the Department of Justice to investigate his bogus claims.
The problem is we need a party that's going to fight, and we have some great congressmen and women that are doing it, and we have some great fighters, but we won this in a landslide. They know it, and we need backing from, like, the Justice Department, and other people have to finally step up.
The Select Committee obtained records from the National Archives that show that Scott Perry was one of the congressmen who joined that meeting.
Ben Shapiro, que decía eso de facts don't care about your feelings. Los hechos no están interesados en tus sentimientos. Y en el vídeo que ha salido antes, Marjorie Taylor Greene, que es una congresista republicana que está pues cucú, ¿no? Decía que muchos estadounidenses sentimos... No, perdona, los sentimientos nos dan igual, nos importan los hechos. No hay hechos del fraude electoral, pues cállate un rato.
Quote, throughout the past 4 years, I've worked with Assistant Attorney General Clark on various legislative matters. When President Trump asked if I would make an introduction, I obliged. But why Jeff Clark? Let's hear Mr. Giuliani explain the kind of person that he and the president wanted at the top of justice.
I remember ever recommending to anybody that Mr. Clark, meaning Jeffrey Clark at DOJ, be given election-related responsibilities.
You mean beyond the president?
Correct.
Well, beyond the president, I do recall saying to people that somebody should be put in charge of the Justice Department who isn't frightened of what's going to be done to their reputation. Because judgment was filled with people like that.
Should put somebody that's not frightened of what's going to be done to their reputation. Mr. Donahue, when you told the president that you...
O sea, Rudy Giuliani decía que el presidente y él estaban buscando a alguien que encabezara el Departamento de Justicia y que no tuviera miedo a que su reputación fuera atacada, ¿no?
Mr. Clark's name was also...
Vamos, básicamente alguien que hiciera lo que ellos quisieran sin tener miedo a que luego los criticaran por saltarse los raíles democráticos.
Was it your understanding that Representative Perry was pushing for a specific person to take over the department?
He wanted Mr. Jeff Clark to take over the Department of Justice.
Mr. Rosen, after your call with President Trump on December 24th, you spoke with Mr. Clark on December 26th about his contact with the president. Can you tell us about that conversation?
Yes. Because I had been quizzical about why his name had come up, I called him and I tried to explore if he would share if there was something I ought to know. And after some back and forth, he acknowledged that shortly before Christmas, he had gone to a meeting in the Oval Office with the president.
What?
That, of course, surprised me. And I asked him, how did that happen? And he was defensive. He said it had been unplanned, that he had been talking to someone he referred to as General Perry, but I believe is Congressman Perry, and that unbeknownst to him, he was asked to go to a meeting and he didn't know it, but it turned out it was at the Oval. He found himself at the Oval Office.
Casualidad en el despacho.
And he was apologetic for that. And I said, well, you didn't tell me about it. It wasn't authorized, and you didn't even tell me after the fact. You know, this is not appropriate. But he was contrite and said it had been inadvertent and it would not happen again. And that if anyone asked him to go to such a meeting, he would notify Rich Donahue and me.
O sea, están diciendo que Jeffrey Clark se presentó en la Casa Blanca para una reunión en el despacho Oval. Esto parece que intermediada por Scott Perry, que es un congresista republicano, que por cierto estos días está muy callado porque sabe que está en problemas. Jeffrey Clark, esto me lo he guardado para ahora, pero Jeffrey Clark hoy han inspeccionado, o sea, han hecho una redada en su casa, el FBI, por órdenes del Departamento de Justicia. Un juez ha tenido que aprobar esa redada para, no se sabe muy bien qué, conseguir quizá archivos de sus ordenadores. Entiendo que también le pueden haber entrado en las líneas de teléfono para ver mensajes previos o lo que sea, pero esto es como parte de una investigación del Departamento de Justicia de Merrick Garland, ¿no? El fiscal general elegido por Biden. Una investigación para descifrar estas estrategias para intentar revertir los resultados de las elecciones en 2020 con la intención de presentar unos electores alternativos, ¿no? Entonces lo que está diciendo es que Jeffrey Clark en su momento se presentó en la Casa Blanca en una reunión en el despacho Oval con Trump, parece que con la posibilidad de que lo eligieran como sustituto de Jeffrey Rosen y se pusiera él al frente del Departamento de Justicia para llevar a cabo todas esas iniciativas que Rosen y Donahue no querían llevar a cabo, ¿no? De decir que se había producido fraude, que las elecciones eran corruptas y demás historias. Jeffrey Clark luego, claro, el Rosen, el que era por entonces fiscal general interino, se entera de que Jeffrey Clark lo están proponiendo como ahí, como posible sustituto suyo, y dice, a ver, cojones, ¿por qué? Jeffrey Clark, ¿quién es este? Pero si es un tío que se encarga de temas medioambientales. Entonces se reúne con Jeffrey Clark y Jeffrey Clark le dice, ay, sí, joder, justo tuve una reunión en la Casa Blanca, pero yo no lo sabía, no sabía que, no sé, de repente terminé ahí dentro hablando con Trump. Y lo sabía perfectamente, o sea, sabía perfectamente que el tío estaba ahí ambicioso por conseguir el puesto de fiscal general de Estados Unidos, ¿no? Y terminan en esa situación. Bueno, pues, claro, evidentemente lo que le dice Rosen es, a ver, esto no lo vuelvas a hacer, no puedes trabajar para mí dentro del Departamento de Justicia, que se supone que tenemos una independencia con respecto a la Casa Blanca, y tener una reunión con Donald Trump. O sea, ¿de qué estás haciendo?
Meeting with the president about legal matters without his knowledge, which was strictly against White House policy. Mr. Cipollone and Mr. Philbin, like Mr. Rosen, told Mr. Clark to stand down, and he didn't. On the same day, Acting Attorney General Rosen told Mr. Clark to stop talking to the White House, Representative Perry was urging Chief of Staff Mark Meadows to elevate Clark within the Department of Justice. You can now see on the screen behind me a series of texts between Representative Perry and Mr. Meadows. They show that Representative Perry requested...
O sea, aquí está diciendo el Scott Perry, congresista republicano, que es el que hace intermediario entre Jeffrey Clark, este fiscal dentro del Departamento de Justicia de temas medioambientales. Entonces están intentando presionar para que lo pongan al frente del Departamento de Justicia antes del 6 de enero, ¿no? Que es cuando se va a certificar el resultado de las elecciones presidenciales. Entonces aquí vemos a Scott Perry escribiéndole a Mark Meadows, por entonces jefe de gabinete de la Casa Blanca. Oye, Mark, solo haciéndome, bueno, pues para que sepas, o sea, bueno, just checking, ¿no? Just checking es como poniéndome en contacto contigo conforme el tiempo se va acabando antes del 6 de enero. Y dice, oye, tienes que llamar a Jeffrey para ver qué pasa, ¿no? Y entonces Mark Meadows le responde, creo que lo entiendo, déjame trabajar para ponerlo como vicefiscal general, es decir, sustituyendo a Richard Donahue. Y luego dice que le ha enviado algo en Signal, un archivo actualizado. ¿Has llamado a Jeffrey Clark?
Representative Perry called you the next day on December 27th. Who told him to call you?
My understanding is the president did at the outset of the call. Congressman Perry told me that he was calling at the behest of the president.
What did he want to talk about?
He wanted to talk about Pennsylvania in particular. He gave me some background about, why he in particular doesn't trust the FBI and why the American people don't necessarily trust the FBI. And then he went into some allegations specific to Pennsylvania, which included, amongst others, this allegation that the Secretary of State had certified more votes than were actually cast.
Did you direct the local U.S. Attorney's Office to investigate that claim?
So Mr. Perry said that he had a great deal of information, that investigations had been done, that there was some sort of forensic-type report that would be helpful to me. And I didn't know Congressman Perry. I'd never heard of him before this conversation, but I said, sir, if you've got something that you think is relevant to what the Justice Department's mission is, you should feel free to send it to me. And he did. And I was en route from New York to Washington. I got it. I looked at it on my iPhone. Obviously, I couldn't read the whole thing in transit like that, but I looked at it to get a feel for what it was, and then I forwarded it to the United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania.
Did they get back to you? What did they conclude?
Scott Brady looked at it. He was the Western District of Pennsylvania U.S. Attorney. Took him a couple of days, but he got back in relatively short order with a pretty clear explanation for why there was no foundation for concern. The Secretary of State had not certified more votes than were actually cast. The difference between the 5.25 that was actually certified by the Secretary of State and the 5 million that was on a public-facing website was that the information on the website was incomplete because 4 counties had not uploaded their data.
So no credibility to that.
There was zero to that.
Bueno, en este caso, Scott Perry, el congresista republicano que hacía intermediario con Jeffrey Clark, que de medioambiental, llama directamente al vicefiscal general interino, que es Richard Doménech, que está hablando del pelo blanco, y lo que le dice es, oye, mira, yo tengo pruebas de que, pues, después de una auditoría, de que en Pensilvania se han contado más votos de lo que se debía, ¿no? El secretario de Estado de Pensilvania ha certificado más votos de lo que debería, y ojito porque aquí Trump igual ha ganado en Pensilvania, ¿no? Scott Perry, además, un congresista que en realidad no debería ponerse en contacto con el vicefiscal general del Departamento de Justicia. Eso es un poco random, y de hecho el vicefiscal general interino dice, yo no lo conocía, no lo había conocido en mi vida, no sabía ni quién era, me llama, me dice esto, me pasa unos documentos, los miro en el iPhone, se lo paso al distrito occidental de Estados Unidos, en este caso dentro del Departamento de Justicia de Pensilvania, para que vea un poco qué es lo que está pasando, y a los 2 días le devuelven una conclusión que le dicen, oye, mira, esto no tiene ningún fundamento, en realidad lo que está diciendo esta auditoría o lo que sea es que hay un recuento que no está bien convalidado con respecto a lo que ponen en la web, pero porque hay 5 condados que no han publicado sus resultados en la web, pero ya está. O sea, los resultados electorales certificados están bien. Entonces, de nuevo, una alegación acerca de fraude electoral a gran escala que no tiene ningún tipo de fundamento, y en este caso pues el vicefiscal general interino dice, tronco, Scott Perry, ¿qué me estás contando? ¿Sabes? O sea, no tiene ningún mérito esto.
Probably a very similar reaction to it. He was not in his office, so I returned to my office and I sat down to draft a response because I thought it was very important to give a prompt response rejecting this out of hand. In my response, I explained a number of reasons this is not the department's role to suggest or dictate to state legislatures how they should select their electors. But more importantly, this was not based on fact. This was actually contrary to the facts as developed by department investigations over the last several weeks and months. So I responded to that, and for the department to insert itself into the political process this way, I think would have had grave consequences for the country. It may very well have spiraled us into a constitutional crisis. And I want to make sure that he understood the gravity of the situation, because
algo de estas características habría sumido al país en una crisis constitucional.
Sent this email to him.
He didn't respond directly to the email, but we met shortly after that. After I sent the email, the acting AG returned. I went to his office. He had just read it. He had a very similar reaction to me. He was exasperated, and he told me that he had told one of his administrative assistants to get Jeff Clark up here. We want to talk to him face-to-face about this. And so the 3 of us then had a meeting, probably around 1800 that night, in the Deputy Attorney General's conference room.
And one of the things that you said to Mr. Clark is, quote, what you are doing is nothing less than the United States Justice Department meddling in the outcome of a presidential election. And I assume you conveyed that to him as well in your meeting that evening?
Yes, in those very words. It was a very contentious meeting, but yes, that was said amongst other things.
And despite this contentious meeting and your strong reaction to the letter, did Mr. Clark continue to push his concept in the coming days?
He did, yes. We had subsequent meetings and conversations. The acting AG probably had more contact with him than I did, but between the 28th and the 2nd, when we had another in-person meeting, he clearly continued to move down this path. He began calling witnesses and apparently conducting investigations of his own. And he got a briefing from DNI about purported foreign intelligence interference. And we thought perhaps once it was explained to him that there was no basis for that part of his concern, that he would retreat. But instead he doubled down and said, well, okay, so there's no foreign interference. I still think there are enough allegations out there that we should go ahead and send this letter, which shocked me even more than the initial one, because you would think after a couple of days of looking at this, he, like we, would have come to the same conclusion that it was completely unfounded.
And when you learned that he had been calling witnesses and conducting investigations on his own, did you confront him?
Yes.
And what was his reaction?
He got very defensive.
O sea, el tío estaba llevando a cabo investigaciones, Jeffrey Clark, el del tipo del medioambiental, estaba llevando a cabo investigaciones por su cuenta, sin el apoyo o sin las órdenes, sin haber recibido órdenes de sus jefes dentro del Departamento de Justicia, lo cual es grave en sí mismo, pero si encima estás persiguiendo sueños acerca de un fraude electoral que no se ha demostrado en ningún caso, pues es incluso más grave todavía, ¿no? Además, con esa pretensión de que Donald Trump le elija y le ponga en el puesto de fiscal general. Interino no, en este caso, bueno, fiscal general interino sí, cabría la posibilidad, porque eso no necesita aprobación del Senado, me parece.
And needed to send those letters.
The committee has also learned that Mr. Clark was working with another attorney at the department named Ken Klukowski, who drafted this letter to Georgia with Mr. Clark. Mr. Klukowski had arrived at the department on December 15th with just 36 days left until the inauguration. He was specifically assigned to work under Jeff Clark. And Mr. Klukowski also worked with John Eastman, who we showed you at our hearing last week was one of the primary architects of President Trump's scheme to overturn the election.
Bueno, al final siempre están implicados los mismos, ¿no? John Eastman, el abogado que ha pregonado la mayoría de teorías de la conspiración acerca del fraude electoral inexistente.
Including, quote, the purpose of the special session the department recommends would be for the General Assembly to determine whether the election failed to make a proper and valid choice between the candidates, such that the General Assembly could take whatever action is necessary to ensure that one of the slates of electors cast on December 14th will be accepted by Congress on January 6th. The committee has also learned that the relationship between Dr. Eastman and Mr. Klukowski persisted after Mr. Klukowski joined the Justice Department. Let's take a look at an email recommending that Mr. Klukowski and Dr. Eastman brief Vice President Pence and his staff. Other recipients of this email included the Chief of Staff to Congressman Louis Gohmert. And the email says, as stated last week, I believe the...
Como mencioné, asegurémonos de que no sobreexponemos a Ken dada su nueva posición. O sea, el tío trabajaba en la Casa Blanca, tenía contactos directos con John Eastman, que es este abogado que pregonó todas estas teorías de la conspiración sobre el fraude electoral, y que luego este Ken empezó a trabajar para el Departamento de Justicia. O sea, tócate la polla.
Letter to Georgia officials to overturn their certified election, and working with Dr. Eastman to help pressure the vice president to overturn the election. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and for answering our questions about this letter and other issues. We asked Mr. Clark some of the same questions that we've asked you, and here's how he answered.
A ver, Clark, hostias.
Did you discuss this draft letter to Georgia officials with the President of the United States?
Fifth, and executive privilege, again, just restated for the abundance of caution.
Okay, if you look again at the draft letter, in the first paragraph, second sentence says, the department will update you as we are able on investigatory progress, but at this time we have identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states, including the state of Georgia. Isn't that, in fact, contrary to what Attorney General Barr had said on December 1st, 2020?
Fifth.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
Pursuant to the order of the committee of today, the chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
Bueno, pues ahí está.
You're watching ABC News live coverage of now the fifth hearing from the January 6th committee before the American people.
Bueno, pues eso es un poco el resumen. Yo creo que más o menos ya tenemos claro. Luego quizás sepamos un poco más de información acerca de Jeffrey Clark y cuál fue su papel, ¿no? Porque ahora hemos escuchado por parte de miembros del Departamento de Justicia, al menos miembros que fiscales que estaban por entonces trabajando para el Departamento de Justicia, acerca del papel de Jeffrey Clark, de las presiones que recibieron por parte de él y de Donald Trump. Ahí lo que veíamos en ese último vídeo es a Jeffrey Clark, este fiscal dentro del Departamento de Justicia que lidiaba con temas medioambientales y que luego tuvo la iniciativa de investigar acerca del posible fraude electoral que nunca se ha demostrado en las elecciones de 2020, y estaba pleading the fifth, ¿no? Estaba no contestando a las preguntas que le hacían los abogados del comité, apoyándose en la quinta enmienda, que es esta que dice que tengo derecho a guardar el silencio porque si no, pues puedo decir algo que me haga culpable, ¿no? No sé cómo se dice la quinta enmienda. A ver un momento que lo busque. Plead the fifth. A ver... ¿Hay una frase como específica? No lo encuentro. Bueno, pero bien, plead the fifth es eso. Por eso en la última respuesta ni siquiera lo ha desarrollado. Ha dicho fifth, ¿no? La quinta, y ya está. Y con eso te ahorras tener que responder a una pregunta que puede ser un poco comprometida porque puede demostrar que eres culpable, ¿no? Entonces, por precaución, no respondo porque quizá esto no lo estoy explicando bien y me termináis señalando como culpable. Así que nada, lo vamos a dejar ahí, gente. Sacaremos mejores conclusiones a lo largo de los próximos días acerca de estas audiencias. Faltan 2 audiencias más que se tienen que celebrar más adelante porque el comité ha recibido pruebas a lo largo de los últimos días. Estamos muy pendientes de un documental que se grabó por aquel entonces y que tiene declaraciones de gente pues muy cercana a Trump, de sus hijos también, a los que entrevistaron en varias ocasiones, y además es todo como contenido muy bruto, ¿no? Se suponía que tanto Trump como sus allegados iban a tener decisión editorial sobre el contenido de ese documental. Bueno, pues ahora no. El comité ha recibido todo el documental entero, todos los brutos de lo que se grabó. Por tanto, puede que tengamos imágenes bastante interesantes de lo que se dijo en ese documental. Como digo, eso lo sabremos en las próximas audiencias del comité. Si no me equivoco, creo que ahora se van de descanso este fin de semana, se van a lo largo de 2 semanas, o sea que no vuelven hasta el 14 de julio, por tanto no lo tendremos hasta la segunda mitad del mes de julio estas nuevas audiencias, por tanto queda un poco en el aire. Muchas gracias por venir hoy por el stream, espero que hayáis aprendido un poco más de qué es lo que está pasando y por qué estas audiencias son importantes. Creo que están poniendo en la primera plana todas estas... iniciativas y estrategias que se llevaron a cabo para intentar revertir los resultados de las elecciones, lo cual es gravísimo, ¿no? Son tendencias autócratas y antidemocráticas muy graves, así que pues, quedamos pendientes de las 2 últimas audiencias. Os mando un besito muy fuerte, que vaya bien el fin de semana si no venís mañana al stream de Viernes Cinéfagos en mi canal, pero si no, nos esperamos mañana a las 8 de la tarde, hora peninsular española, en mi canal, twitch.tv/nanísimo, para hablar de cine, ver ver trailers de pelis y de series que van a salir en los próximos meses. Venga, un besito, que vaya muy bien, adiós, bye bye.